Welcome to another deep dive, this time straight into the heart of a medieval philosophical puzzle.
Ooh, fun.
We're going to be grappling with Peter Damian today, an 11th century thinker who definitely was not afraid to ask some seriously tough questions about the nature of God's power.
You're right. He may not be a household name like, say, Aquinas or Augustine,
Right?
but his work really digs deep into some incredibly profound concepts, particularly when it comes to divine omnipotence.
And that is exactly where we are headed today.
Okay, great.
We've got his De Divina Omnipotentia, on divine omnipotence, ready to unpack.
Excellent.
And this isn't just some, dry theological treatise.
Right.
Damian tackles questions that I think still resonate with us today. Can God change the past? Does he have limits? And what does that even mean for us, for our understanding of free will and, the consequences of our actions?
You've hit the core of it there. I think
Right.
Damian just dives headfirst into this paradox of omnipotence.
Yeah.
And specifically the question of whether God can undo the past. He even uses a rather provocative example. Can God restore a woman's virginity?
Okay. I can already see how this is going to get philosophically complex pretty fast. But before we get lost in the weeds here,
Yeah.
can we take a step back and kind of provide some context for Damian's ideas? Like, who was this guy and what was going on in the world that might have influenced his thinking?
Excellent point. To understand Damian, you need to understand his world.
Okay.
So born in Italy around 1007, he had a pretty dramatic shift in his life.
Oh?
He started as a teacher of rhetoric, but then a spiritual awakening led him to become a Benedictine monk.
That is quite the career change.
He is quite a change.
From the art of persuasion to a life of austerity and contemplation.
Exactly. And this personal transformation really deeply informed his writings.
Okay.
Damian became a really prolific author known for his rigorous and sometimes very fiery prose.
Wow.
And he was a key figure in the 11th century reform movement within the church, advocating for stricter monastic discipline and really combating corruption.
So he wasn't just an ivory tower philosopher. He was really engaged in the practical and ethical issues of his time.
Precisely. And this commitment to moral reform is interwoven with his philosophical explorations.
Okay.
So it's crucial to keep in mind that for Damian, these questions about omnipotence weren't just intellectual exercises.
Right.
They had really profound implications for how we understand God ourselves and even the moral fabric of reality.
Okay, so we've got this monk turned reformer grappling with some seriously heavy philosophical questions.
Yes.
Let's get back to that provocative question about restoring virginity.
Okay.
Where does Damian land on this, and why is it so controversial?
This is where Damian really digs into the paradox of omnipotence.
Okay.
The passage in De Divina Omnipotentia, specifically 612 AB, caused quite a stir.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like he's flat out rejecting the principle of non-contradiction, the very foundation of classical logic.
Wait, so he's saying that God can make something both be and not be at the same time?
Yes.
That just sounds like a recipe for philosophical chaos.
It does. If we take his words literally, that's exactly what it sounds like.
Okay.
But modern scholars, delving deeper into the text and considering the broader context of Damian's thought, have offered, I think, a more nuanced interpretation.
So Damian isn't actually throwing logic out the window.
Not quite. The key lies in understanding how Damian defines omnipotence.
Okay.
He's not saying God can do literally anything, but rather that God can do anything that is good.
Okay, so that distinction is crucial.
Yes.
So not being able to do evil isn't a limit on God's power, but rather a reflection of his inherently good nature.
You've got it for Damian. Evil is essentially nothingness, a privation of good.
Okay.
So it's not that God can't perform evil acts,
Right.
but rather that such acts are simply outside the scope of his omnipotence, which is inherently oriented towards the good.
This makes me think of, how we often define a superhero's power
Right.
by their ability to do good.
Yes.
Not being able to harm innocent people isn't a weakness, it's part of what makes them a hero.
That's a great analogy. Damian is arguing that God's power isn't diminished by not being able to do evil.
Right.
It's precisely his commitment to good that defines his omnipotence.
So with this definition in mind, how does Damian address the question of restoring virginity? Does he believe that God can, in fact, undo this specific act?
He does, but with important caveats,
Oh.
according to Damian, because the loss of virginity is considered an evil.
Right.
Its restoration would be a good act.
Okay.
And since God can do anything good, he could theoretically restore virginity.
But doesn't that seem like messing with the past?
It does.
How does that square with his overall arguments about the immutability of God's plan and the limits of his power?
This is where Damian's nuance comes into play.
Okay.
He's not talking about literally rewinding time or changing the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah.
Instead, he's referring to restoring spiritual wholeness, which he calls merits,
Okay.
or even physical integrity through a miraculous act.
So it's not about going back in time, but rather about God enacting a change in the present, a kind of divine intervention that restores something that was lost.
Exactly. Damian uses a brilliant analogy to illustrate this point.
Okay.
He compares restoring virginity to closing a door that was previously opened.
Okay.
You're not traveling back in time, you're simply changing the present state of the door.
That's a helpful way to visualize it.
It is.
But this still leaves us with, I think, the bigger question. Can God undo the past in a broader sense? Can he change what's already happened, even if it's not about something like virginity?
That's where Damian's argument gets even more intriguing, and where his concept of divine providence takes center stage.
Right.
He actually gives two answers to that question, and
Yeah.
they're both incredibly nuanced.
Okay. This is where I'm really going to need your expertise to guide us through this philosophical labyrinth.
I'm happy to help navigate.
All right.
So let's start with Damian's primary argument, which is a resounding no. He believes God cannot undo the past because it would contradict his very nature and the immutability of his providence.
Okay, so Damian says no to undoing the past.
He does.
But help me understand how this connects to his concept of divine providence.
Okay, sure.
I think we need a little refresher on that before we dive deeper.
Absolutely. Divine providence is essentially God's plan for the universe. You know, it's a
Alright.
concept that theologians and philosophers have grappled with for centuries.
Right.
Damian, building on the ideas of Augustine,
Okay.
believed that God's knowledge encompasses everything past, present, and future all at once.
Okay.
He sees all of time in a single eternal now.
So for God, there's no linear progression of time like we experience.
Right.
It's all just one big eternal present.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this is where Damian's argument against undoing the past gets really interesting.
Okay.
If God experiences all of time simultaneously,
Yeah.
then the past from his perspective is just as fixed and unchanging as the present.
So to ask God to change the past would be like asking him to change something that's already happening right now in his eternal present.
Exactly.
It would be a contradiction.
It would be a contradiction, and Damian takes this concept very seriously.
Yeah.
He argues that to even suggest that God could change the past is not only logically absurd, but also borders on blasphemy.
Oh, wow.
He actually uses some pretty strong language in his writing,
Okay.
saying that those who propose this idea should be spat upon.
He definitely does not mince words.
No, he doesn't.
It seems like for Damian, questioning the immutability of the past is like a direct attack on God's power and knowledge.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this emphasis on the unchanging nature of God's plan
Okay.
leads us to Damian's second and perhaps even more challenging argument about undoing the past.
Okay, so he says no, but then there's a second argument.
There is.
This is where I really need you to break it down for me because this sounds incredibly complex.
It is subtle, but hang in there. It's worth unpacking.
Oh.
So Damian's supplementary argument suggests that because God's power is eternal, it was always possible for him to prevent certain events from happening in what we perceive as the past.
Wait, so he's saying that God could have created a different past.
Right.
But doesn't that completely contradict everything he just said about the immutability of what's already occurred?
That's the paradox.
Okay.
But remember, Damian was incredibly careful and precise with his language.
Okay.
He's not actually suggesting that God can go back in time and tinker with events.
Okay.
Instead, he's pointing out the limitations of human language when we try to describe God's eternal power.
So it's more about our limited perspective of time, right?
It is.
We see the past as this fixed series of events, but from God's eternal viewpoint, it's all part of one unified now.
Exactly.
Okay.
Damian is implying that God's eternal his ability to do all things good
Right.
doesn't translate into a temporal, could have changed in the past.
Okay. I think starting to see what he's getting at.
Hmm.
It's like we're looking back at history and saying, what if things had gone differently?
Right.
But for God, there's no what if.
Exactly.
Everything from our perspective of the past, present, and future is from his perspective.
Damian seems to be playing with grammar and tenses here,
Okay.
highlighting the limitations of human language when we try to grasp the complexities of God's eternal existence.
Right.
He's not suggesting God changes the past.
Okay.
He's pointing out that our temporal way of thinking just doesn't apply to God.
This is giving me a philosophical headache,
I know, me too.
but in a good way.
It is fascinating.
So Damian's first argument says God can't change the past because it contradicts his nature and the fixed nature of his plan.
Right.
But the second argument is more about clarifying the limitations of how we as humans, bound by time, talk about God's eternal power.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think this tension between the two arguments is precisely what makes Damian such a fascinating figure.
Right.
He pushes us to the very edge of what we can comprehend,
Yeah.
forcing us to confront the limits of our own logic and language when grappling with the nature of God.
It's like he's saying, yes, there are truths about God, but our human ways of talking about them can only take us so far.
Precisely. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of Damian's thought.
Yeah.
His deep concern with the ethics of language when discussing these profound concepts.
Okay, let's talk about that. Damian seemed very aware of the power of words, especially when it came to matters of faith and God's omnipotence.
He was.
Why was this so important to him?
Damian believed that some truths, even if logically sound, could be dangerous if expressed in a way that might confuse or mislead people,
Right.
particularly when it comes to their faith.
Okay.
He argued that there's a responsibility to use language carefully, especially when discussing such sensitive and potentially destabilizing ideas.
It's like he's saying, just because you can say something doesn't mean you should,
Right.
especially when it comes to matters of faith.
Exactly. And I think this idea is particularly relevant today in our age of, instant communication and social media, where information, both accurate and misleading, spreads like wildfire.
It makes you wonder what Damian would make of our modern debates about free speech and cancel culture, or the responsibility we have when sharing information online.
Right.
Would he see any parallels to his own concerns about the ethics of language?
It's a fascinating question. He might argue that our constant need to express every thought, regardless of its potential impact, could lead to more harm than good,
Right.
especially when it comes to complex theological concepts that require careful consideration and nuance.
So to summarize Damian's position so far, he argues that God cannot change the past because it contradicts his nature and the immutability of his providence.
Yes.
However, he also acknowledges the limitations of human language in grasping God's eternal can, suggesting that what appears to be a contradiction might stem from our limited temporal perspective.
Right.
And finally, he emphasizes the ethical responsibility we have in using language carefully, particularly when discussing sensitive religious matters.
That's a brilliant summary.
Thank you.
You've managed to capture the essence of Damian's very complex arguments.
Well, I couldn't have done it without your expert guidance, but I'm curious, what are the broader implications of Damian's ideas? How have they influenced later thinkers? And do they still hold relevance for us today?
Yeah, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of Damian's thinking.
We have. There's so much more we could say.
What kind of impact did his ideas have on, later philosophical and theological discussions?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Damian's work really sparked debate and discussion that just kind of reverberated through the centuries.
Okay.
His nuanced views on omnipotence challenged later thinkers to grapple with these limits of God's power and the inherent paradox of trying to reconcile that with human free will.
So he wasn't just like a lone voice in the wilderness.
No, not at all. His ideas actually helped shape the course of philosophical debate.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas,
Right.
while not always agreeing with Damian,
Right.
really engaged deeply with his arguments.
Okay.
They grappled with the implications of Damian's views on the relationship between God's will,
Right.
human agency,
Okay.
and the nature of time itself.
It sounds like Damian's work, even when controversial, really served as a catalyst for some incredibly important philosophical conversations.
It did, and this is where we start to see the enduring legacy of Damian's ideas.
Okay.
Even though his writing, might seem rooted in a very specific medieval context,
Yeah.
his questions about power, free will, the limits of human understanding, they're timeless.
They are. It makes you wonder what Damian would make of our modern world.
Right.
We're so obsessed with controlling the past, predicting the future, debating every possible what-if scenario.
It's true.
Do you think his ideas might offer some perspective on our very contemporary anxieties?
I think Damian's perspective would be both fascinating and challenging for us today. Imagine him encountering our social media debates where nuanced arguments are often just completely lost in this sea of outrage and simplification.
Oh, absolutely. I can almost picture him shaking his head,
Yeah.
At our attempts to cancel history or rewrite the past to fit our present-day sensibilities.
I can too.
Wouldn't he argue that accepting the immutability of God's plan,
I think so.
even the parts we might find uncomfortable, is essential for true faith and peace of mind?
Absolutely. Damien might see our constant striving to manipulate the past or control the future as a distraction from the present moment, the only time in which we can truly act and make choices.
It's almost as if he anticipated our modern obsession with undoing or controlling things that are ultimately beyond our grasp.
It is.
He might even suggest that this anxiety stems from a lack of trust in God's providence.
That's a really profound insight. And remember Damien's emphasis on the ethics of language. I can only imagine what he'd make of the way we communicate today, especially online.
Would he be appalled by the speed and carelessness with which accusations are thrown around?
Yeah.
Or would he see some glimmer of hope in our attempts, however imperfect, to engage in complex dialogues about faith ethics and the human condition?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
I think Damien would urge us to pause,
Yeah.
to consider the weight of our words, and to approach these conversations with a sense of humility and responsibility.
Yeah.
He'd remind us that even the most seemingly abstract theological debates have real-world consequences.
So what does this all mean for us, the modern day listeners wrestling with our own existential puzzles?
Right.
What can we take away from Damien's exploration of omnipotence language and the limits of human understanding?
I think Damien offers us a really powerful framework for navigating the complexities of faith ethics and the human condition.
Okay.
He encourages us to embrace nuance, to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge, and to engage in difficult conversations with both intellectual rigor and a deep sense of responsibility.
He challenges us to think deeply about the implications of our words and actions, recognizing that even in our technologically advanced world, some things remain beyond our control,
Absolutely.
subject to a larger plan that we can only strive to understand.
And perhaps most importantly, he reminds us that true wisdom lies not in seeking to dominate or manipulate reality, but in learning to accept it, even with its imperfections, as part of a grander design.
It's a powerful message that transcends the boundaries of time and continues to resonate centuries later.
It really does.
We might not have all the answers to the questions that Damien raised, but his work offers us a really valuable roadmap for navigating the complexities of faith ethics and the human experience.
Indeed it does. And it leaves us with a final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If even God, in Damien's view, is bound by certain principles, how does that shape our understanding of human freedom and responsibility? Are we truly free agents, or are we too subject to limitations that we might not fully comprehend?
That's something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.